Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. I'm your host Leon Gordon, and we're back for another weekly dose of Power BI goodness to help us on our learning journey within the community. Now, as you all know, we want this to be a very interactive session, so the Q&A is now open. If you could please just pop in there where you're joining us from. It could be globally, it could be in the UK. Just let us know wherever you're based. Hopefully your weather's a bit better than ours is today. We had a little bit of sunshine, but not that great. Typical UK. We can still call it winter, I think. And also let us know what you're expecting to get from this session. So with that being said, the Q&A is now open. Within today's session, we're going to be looking at how to enrich your data models with API datasets with Lewis Holmes. So I'll just give a brief background on Lewis before I hand over to him for his session. So Lewis is a business intelligence consultant, working mainly within the Microsoft Data Platform. He holds more than 10 years experience working with large companies, helping them to organize and better understand their data. Lewis, without any further ado, I'll hand over to you. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Leon, and welcome everyone to today's session of the Power BI user group. If my screen's up, you'll be seeing the banner that Leon put together. This is me, this is a picture of me, and then I'm just going to go and tell you a little bit more about myself. Leon did cover most of this, but yes, I'm a business intelligence consultant, 10 years experience, mainly with the Microsoft platform. So it did start a long time ago with all the on-premise technologies, SSIS, RS, AS, SQL Server, and then more recently I moved into Power BI and all the nice Azure toys, Data Factory, Logic Apps, Storage Account, Data Lakes, all those cool technologies you can get now through Azure. So I am a contractor, and at the moment I'm doing some work for Microsoft, one of their clients, and in the past I've had jobs for places such as Manchester Airport Group, Betfred, and multinational manufacturers. So the presentation I'm going to do today is going to be talking about APIs and how you can access them from Power BI and specifically Power Query. And it's based on a scenario I was given by a client recently. So what did they want? Okay, so the client wanted to know the environmental footprint of their employees' commute. So in this company, everyone was driving to an office, unluckily for them. But so they were driving from A to B every day and then back home in the evening. So they want to know, okay, well, how much CO2 is that producing? And they would also like to know like a really good pinpoint location of the employee's home address. So they obviously have their address in the database, but they want like a latitude and longitude. So we talked through all the requirements, and yeah, it came out that they did want latitude and longitude coordinates for their employees' addresses and also their office addresses. And then using those two bits of information, we want to calculate how long it would take to drive, or indeed walk, or through public transport, get from their house to their place of work. And then this data, the employee data and the office data, that was all in a SQL Server table. But we didn't have any ability to put data back into SQL Server. So with every Power BI refresh, we're going to have to calculate this kind of commuting distance. So can't put anything back into SQL, it just needs to be contained within Power BI. So yeah, so the solution I came up with for them was that we're going to get the employee and office data from SQL Server. We'll load that into a Power BI model, and then we will use the Bing Maps API to calculate the latitude and longitude of all these home and office locations. And then again, use the Bing Maps API to calculate how long it will take to drive to and from work. And then once we've got all that nice data, we'll add those as extra columns, probably on the employees table, and bring that back into Power BI proper. And then we can do some measures, figure out what is perhaps the CO2 usage, and perhaps figure out how much it will cost to offset that. So, right, let's do it. So what do I need? So I'm going to bring up Chrome. So a good place to start is with the Bing Maps API, because this is something we're going to have to use. In fact, I've changed my mind. Let's bring up Power BI Desktop. Let's do that first. So it's just loading up. It's opened up on my other monitor, so just give me a second to drag it off. Come on. So I'm going to get that employee data from SQL Server. So I'm going to do get data from SQL Server. I have a SQL Server database on this computer, but obviously it could be anywhere. I'm just to connect to my local host. And there's an employees table in here somewhere. So let's just load that. So the employees table is quite small for the purposes of this demonstration. There are only 10 rows. And we have the employee's home and the employee's work address. So these are all different places in Lancashire. I live up in Lancashire, so it just seemed relevant. And these are all different locations of Wetherspoons pubs in Lancashire. But it's all the same, isn't it? So what we're going to try and do is figure out the latitude and longitude of all these places, the same for all of these places, and then figure out how far it is for this fictional employee 1 to drive from here to here. So in your database, you might have separate columns for like street names, localities, towns, postcodes, countries, or whatever. In my testing for this particular API call, it was better if I concatenated it into one string like this. And obviously that's quite a simple process in Power BI. So I'm just starting off from this point so I can show you how the API works. So when you communicate with an API, nearly all of them need some method to identify who you are. Most APIs don't let you just connect to it and say, give me some data without kind of identifying yourself. They do this for security. They do this to make sure you're not going to overload their servers. And they do this to make sure you'll get just the right slice of the right piece of information relevant to you. And the Bing Maps API is no different. We need to go there and ask for a key that identifies who we are. So if I bring up Bing Maps, so Bing Maps portal is the URL, and if you sign in with your Microsoft account, I can go to see my keys. So I'll already have one here that I created for my testing, but I'll just show you kind of how easy it is to create a new key for the Bing Maps API. We're going to create a new one. Power BI user group, we don't need a URL. We're going to tell it it's a website, and we're just going to create that key. So the Bing Maps API is free to use, and within certain constraints you won't be charged. But there are certain calls you can make where you are restricted, and if you make more than 1,000 in a day, then your key will get blocked. And then at that point you need to go into like a paid tier. But everything we're doing today in the work I did for my clients, it was all within the free tier. So I can show the key here, and you end up with something like this. And I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to save it in my notepad over to the left. So this is the key we're going to use while making all these different calls. Okay, so the next place you want to look perhaps is the actual documentation of how to make an API call. So the Bing Maps API, the documentation is on this URL. And at the end of the day, it's just a web request. You're just getting the URL, constructing it in a certain way, and then submitting it to the service. So it tells you here that there are a few different ways you can find a location. You can do it by address. And in the address scenario, you do have to give it individual postcodes, addresses, countries, neighborhoods, and that kind of stuff. And it can be quite tricky matching what's in your database to those specific fields, especially if you're doing it worldwide. They don't always map very nicely, which is why in my answer solution today, I'm going to do it by query. So it's as though you were typing into the search bar in Bing Maps. So you would type in a street, comma, town, comma, postcode, or something like that. So the way you interact with it is by constructing the URL that looks something like this. Now, it might be worth just quickly explaining the different parts of a URL for those people who are not very familiar. So you can tell I've been doing this already. So if I just open this image in a new tab. So typically in the URL, you have a bit at the start, which is the domain name. This is like wikipedia.org. You have a path, which tells you where on the server you're going to look. And then you have the parameters, and these are where APIs come into their own, these parameters. And then this anchor portion isn't something we're going to be used, but that kind of auto scrolls your page to a certain point. So in this example here, there's a parameter called title, and I've set it to burrito. But you can have as many parameters as you want. So if I pull up this picture, maybe you can see on this one, they've got two parameters. They've got doc_id is equal to something, all these numbers, and HL is equal to that. So basically anything after the question mark is a parameter, and you can have multiple if you separate them with an ampersand. So that's what the API documentation is telling us. It's telling us we need to make a call to this website. This is the certain location within the website, and then these are all the parameters. We need to give it the query, and there's a parameter called include neighborhood. There's a parameter called include value. There's one called match results, and then of course there's one for that key that I just generated. Now, so it's not always obvious what some of these things mean, and it will depend at the end of the day what kind of documentation you have with your API. Some of them give you loads of really good detailed documentation. Some of them don't. So ultimately, it's trial and error, kind of figuring out what's important and what isn't. But in this example, we can scroll down and we can see include neighborhood. Okay, so that specifies to include neighborhood with you. So this is going to give us a bit more information on the results if we include that. And this is also going to give us a bit more information, but it's also telling us that all these are optional. But the one that's required is the actual query, so the thing you're typing into the Bing Maps kind of search bar. So what you could do now is you could grab this and start trying to construct a URL up, but it can be quite tricky, and with more complex API calls, it can be kind of nearly impossible to get it working right. So I like using a third-party tool. So there's a tool called Postman, which is invaluable in helping you debug API requests. Now, for the kind of things we're going to be using it for in terms of testing queries into an API, Postman is free. You do have to sign up and get a license, but it is free. If you're kind of developing an API, you can do loads of testing, it can do stress tests, all these complicated stuff. But for what I'm using it for today, just testing out my request, it is kind of free. So I can go back here and I can copy this example request and I can give it to Postman. And it's already figured out what all the different parameters are. So it's figured out what query is. So there we go, query. It's figured out include neighborhoods a parameter, include max results. So it's included all these. So because these are optional, I'm just going to get rid of them. And you can see it's changing my URL as we go. So in order to just prove this works, that I've got a correct key, I'm pointing at the right location. I'm going to paste in my key that I generated. And I'm just going to give an address. So one that's fairly local to me is a location of a popular football team. So I've just stuck that in the query and I've given it the key. So you can see now it's built up the URL for me. So I've not had to type this in manually. And I've not had to worry about URL encoding or any of that stuff that I don't understand. I've just stuck in a search and a key. And if I press send, that goes off to the API. And here we go, it's come back with some information for me. It said we've got resource sets, and we've got all this information here about kind of a bounding box, we've got its full address, postcodes now, and then we've got points, and we've got all this nice information, but really all we want is these coordinates. Okay, so what we need to do now is to make Power BI generate a request that's like this, and then we need to make it dynamic. So this query here isn't just hard coded, it's depends on what's in the database. So yeah, so I'm just going to grab this and I'm going to go back to Power BI. And what I'm going to do is, if you might call it cheating, but I've got one I made earlier that I'm going to pull up on my other screen in case all the code goes wrong. So on my other screen now, I've got another example. So if it all starts failing and I start struggling, I can cut and paste something. Okay, so that's up. So for some reason, Power BI is frozen. It started doing that. So there we go, it's woken up. Cool. So at the moment, the only thing in my model is this employees table with the home and work. So I'm going to get a new data source. I'm going to say web, and I'm going to paste in not that. I'm going to paste in the whole URL. So this thing that Postman's generated for me. So it's got the API key and it's got the search, it's got everything. So this will dump me into Power Query. Cool. And what it's done is it's created a few steps. It's created the source step where it's doing web.contents and it's got the URL which matches the URL. It's converted that to a table and then it's like navigated to certain bits within the JSON document. So because we don't really want all of this, I'm just going to remove it because we're just after the latitude and longitude, aren't we? So I'm going to take it all the way back to here. And then again, another thing Postman helps with. So I'm going to say, okay, we want these coordinates. So I need to look in resource sets, then resources, then geocode points, and then there. So then that's how I should be able to find it. So, okay, resource sets, which is a list. And we've got resources and geocode points, coordinates. Here we go. So this is the latitude and longitude for that football ground. And it's navigated all the way down there. At the moment, it's not strictly speaking a table, so you can right click and you convert it to a table. And that just gives you then all the options within the Power Query. And what I'd like to do is pivot this, so I've got two columns. And if anyone has a better way of how to do this, please put it in the chat. But the pivot function is not available because I only have one column, which is frustrating. So what I've been doing is adding in an index column and then pivoting that index column. So now I've got this, and I can call this latitude and I can call this longitude. And I'm going to tell them these are decimals. So that's all nice, that's working, and I can hit refresh and that will go off to the API, do the same call, and these haven't changed obviously. So if I jump into the advanced editor now and show you the M code, what we need to do now is make this so it's kind of a bit more dynamic. We can't have this query hard coded. Okay, so the first thing to do, I think, will be to create a couple of parameters. So if you've not used parameters before, you can just kind of right click in this area, do new parameter, and it's just a kind of a variable. So if you're working with APIs, I would always recommend you have a parameter which is your API key, and stick that in there like that. So that's the key I generated before, and you save that, and then you can refer to that anywhere you want in Power Query in your dataset. And more importantly, when you're on the Power BI service, that's something that's exposed to the dataset. So if you blow up your API one day and this key gets barred, you can go and create another key and stick it in there, and then everything should carry on working. And then we're going to create another parameter, a call search query. I'm doing it like this because ultimately we want this to be a function. So we're going to make a custom function that takes just the search query. So but for the time being, it's easier if I have it as a parameter and then convert it later. So I'll put that in there. Okay, so now we can go back in the advanced editor. Instead of having all this text here, we can remove that and do a simple string concatenation. You can see search query, so we'll reference that variable, and instead of this key being hard coded, API key. So now if I press done, everything should carry on working as it was. So with the first step to be more dynamic, because now I can go into this query and put Paris or something, and then this has changed significantly. We're no longer at 53 degrees, we're 48. So we know this query is picking up the value of this parameter. So you might be tempted to kind of say you're done now, but unfortunately, if you try and publish this to the Power BI service, you will not be able to get this dataset to refresh. The web.contents function will only refresh through the Power BI service if the URL is static. So you can't have anything dynamic like what I'm doing here. Fortunately, there is a way around this. And the way to do that is that there are some other functions of there are some other options you can specify within web.contents that allow you to move the dynamic aspect of it away from the first parameter. So I'll just show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to create a few variables in Power Query, and to avoid any ambiguity, I'm going to put a v at the start. So I'm going to say the search query, that the thing I'm searching for is the search query. I've got my API key. Don't forget your commas on these. So we have that, and then what else do we want? Okay, so the first step to making this static is to move out anything after the domain name. So this part here, rest/v1/locations, we're going to move that here, and we're going to call that relative path, and we're going to hard code that. Another bit we need to allow for is this kind of the parameters. So you can actually build an array up in Power Query by just using square brackets like this. And there's two parts of the array, and the parts of the array need to match kind of this here. So it says query. The query isn't going to equal, it's going to equal what I've set up here, this variable search query. And the key is going to equal this API key. Excellent. So now we can change this URL, and I'm just going to create a bit more space. So I'm going to do web.contents. I'll bring that down. So, and then I'll delete all this stuff. That's not relevant now. So we're doing web.contents, but then we're going to provide a load of extra parameters in the form of an array. And these extra parameters will tell it the relative path, so it'll tell it to go to this part of the URL, and then we'll tell it to build a query up from this. So it is as simple as saying relative path equals the variable relative path, and the query equals the variable query. Sorry for that, I just had a bit of a cough. Here we go. I'm just trying to make this kind of formatted a bit nicer so we can see what's going on. So no longer do we have the long URL here. We're just going to say, okay, we're going to make a request to this domain, but then within that domain, we're going to go to this path, which is this, and then we're going to have some parameters which are in this query array here. So if I've done that correctly now, I should be able to press done, and I should get some answers, but I've missed a comma somewhere. But it's usually quite good at telling me where it is. So we've got comma, search query, JSON documents. I've missed a close bracket, I reckon. All right. Yes, there we go. Cool. And with having all these nice variables, you can click on them in the kind of in Power Query. So you can see, okay, what am I passing in as a search query? What's the key? The relative path is this, and what query am I trying to generate? Oh, I'm trying to generate this. So it allows you to kind of debug this stuff quite easily. So if you change it back to that value, and then we look at the query again, the query's changed, and that's great. And then what's output has also changed. So cool, we're making good progress. So because the two bits that are important, the API key and the search query, because they're parameters, we can just go straight ahead and turn this into a function. So you can right click on the Power Query and the query here, create function, and I'm going to call it get function get lat one. And it's already figured out what the parameter should be. Cool. So for some reason, I'm just going to jump into the advanced bit. And the first what I'm going to do is rearrange this. When you create a function through this method, it puts all the parameters and all the Power Query into one folder. And I tend not to like it working like that. So I'm going to create a new group and call it parameters. And I'm going to put my parameters in there. I'm going to create a new group and call this functions. So the intention is that you can't edit this function through the interface at the moment. So the Power Query will leave the original one in place. So as you change this, the changes get pushed to this other one. Now, I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to detach it from that, and I'm going to delete the original group. Because I reckon I can do it without that, I can do it straight in Power Query. So the first thing I noticed is it's coming up with this search query and telling me it's optional, where it definitely isn't optional. So I'm just going to jump in the advanced editor and just tell it that it's, I think that makes it compulsory, does it? Yeah, there we go. So now we can call this function on top of our employees table, and we should get the latitude and longitudes. So let's just go ahead and do that. So we go to add column, invoke our custom function. And it's this one. Now, for some reason, it doesn't let you pick a parameter from here. So I'm just having to put a placeholder text in for the API key. But the thing we're searching for, you can choose a column. So that's good. Okay. So if you do anything wrong in Power Query, that means your API call is rejected by the server. This is the error message you get. And it's very rarely anything different, and it's very rarely anything more helpful. So that's why I always have Postman in the background. Kind of, if it's working in Postman, then I know I've done something wrong in Power Query. And it can be something as simple as like case sensitivity or something. In this case, I just need to tell it to use the API key, I hope. And it's thinking about it, and here we go. So for each row, it's gone off and it's added a table, and I can click on this and I can see the values. So these are the latitude and longitudes of all these home locations. So I'm just going to expand that out like this. And I can call this home latitude, home longitude. And now I'm going to do exactly the same thing with the work location. So again, I can't give it the parameter straight away. So it's errored, but then change it back. And now it's gone off and it's done those queries to the API and it's found out the latitude and longitudes for all these different locations. So I'm going to expand those out. Work latitude, work longitude. So that's the first step now. This is pretty good. You can then, in fact, I'll do it. I'll close and apply that, and we'll get it back into Power BI. So now, as part of the dataset refresh, you do have to wait for those API calls. But then you can bring up a map object, and you can give it the home latitude, straight in the latitude column, straight in the longitude column. Look at that; it's matching up to all these different places in Lancashire that have got pubs. So we know that's working well now, and we could do the same thing for the work ones if we just kind of overwrite those. Work longitude. So these are all the work ones, which are again just different pubs. So now we need to figure out the distance between these two. So we're going to jump back to the API documentation, and there's a totally different section for routing. And there are lots of options. The Bing Maps API is huge, but the one I've been using is this distance matrix. So in a distance matrix, it allows you to submit an API call and give it a series of locations and destinations. So where's an example here? Here we go. So you can give it a series of origins, as it calls it, or starting points, and you can give it a series of destinations, and then it finds out the distance between all the different combinations of those things. So in theory, we could take our 10 rows and put in 10 origins here, and we could then take our workplaces, build in 10 destinations, and then kind of, so we're doing a kind of a big grouping, and then we'd have to do a big ungrouping on the other side. Now that is possible, and I have done that, but it is quite complicated, a lot of Power Query, and perhaps a bit outside the scope of what I want to show today. So today I'm going to make a separate API call individually for every employee. So there'll only be one origin and there'll only be one destination. but then it will tell us the distance between them. The downside of that is you have to make 10 calls to the API instead of 1. It's worth pointing out the differences between these asynchronous and synchronous API requests. An asynchronous request, you would send something off to the API, and then it will give you like a ticket or a number, and then every so often you have to go, have you finished with this number 5? Have you processed it? Then it'll either go no, or it'll go yes, I have. Here's the data. As far as I know, there isn't a way to get Power BI or Power Query to interact with an asynchronous API. You can't get it to go into some sort of loop and keep querying it, saying, "Are you ready yet? Are you ready yet?" So in the work I've had to do, I've done a synchronous request, which is the one where you give it the thing you want and then you wait for it to do it. So there's no checking it. Have you finished? It just says, "I want this," and then you wait half a second and it says done. So this request here, the documentation is pretty good. It's telling us we need to make a URL like this, but there's a couple of extra bits we didn't do last time. We're doing a post request. So if you're ever on the website and you fill in a form and you hit submit, you will notice that all that information that was on that form isn't kind of in the URL at the top like this. It's not saying first name equals this. That's not very secure. So when you submit a form on the website, you are actually doing a post request, and it sends all that in the background. And we're going to do the same thing today. We're going to call this URL with the key, but then in the background, we're going to send a payload, as I call it, of, okay, we want to know the distance between this origin and this destination. So as before, the first thing to do is try and get this working in Postman. So let's go for it. So jump back there, do a new query, and this time you need to make sure you change it to a post request. So then you can add that JSON information. And I'm going to grab my API key. And then what else does it say we have to do? It says we need to create a header. We need content length, and we need content type in the header. So Postman lets you do that. So both Postman and Power Query will generate the content length automatically. It will look at what you're submitting and it will figure out the right value. So you don't have to worry about content length, but you do have to worry about content type, because you need to tell it you're going to be sending a JSON payload. And then it's as simple as sticking a payload in this part of the interface here. So I have something I saved before, which will just make it a bit simpler. And then if I submit that, you can see the API has gone off and it's giving me a bad request. Super. I've got some extra characters here for some reason. Here we go. Okay, so in our case, there's only one destination and one origin. If you had a full matrix with lots of them, you'll get lots of results. But in this case, it's just one. And it's these bits that we want to kind of get into our reports. This is the distance in kilometers and the travel distance, duration in minutes. So now we need to go and try and do this in Power Query. So let's go back here and let's go back into Power Query. So as a starting point, I'm just going to duplicate this function because a lot of the structure is the same. But I'm going to remove the bit that makes it a function, which is this top bit here and this bottom bit. So it's no longer a function, it's just a normal kind of Power Query statement. Okay. And then we know from Postman that this search query isn't relevant anymore. We're not interested in that, but we are interested in the API key. The path has changed now, so we're going to rest v1 routes distance matrix. So we need to grab that bit, so that bit's changed. And then the query, the bit that's in the URL, we're not interested in that bit. It's just the key that was there, wasn't it? It just says and key equals this. So that's all right. So let me go back here. So one thing we do need to do that's different is add the header in to tell it's expecting a JSON kind of payload. So we can do headers, and I think the way you do it is where my hash key is on this keyboard. You cut and paste them. I'm using a different keyboard for this one that's not as loud, and it doesn't have the hash key. Let's go. Okay, just bear me a second. So, where is it? Here it is. Okay, so then we want to give it the header that says the content type is application JSON, just like that. And then the complicated bit is building up this payload that looks like this. So I'm just going to cut and paste the whole thing for the moment, just to see where we are. So, okay, so we need to create this. So to do this query, there's a really nice function. I'm going to call it JSON payload is equal to, and then you can call something called JSON.FromValue. And this allows you to, if you construct an array a bit like this, it will then convert that into its JSON representation. So it's a bit more complicated than the arrays we've been doing so far. I'm just going to go off and I'm going to create that now, and then you should see how it works. So we need some square brackets here. So we've got origins, and you have to be really careful. Any typo like that will just mean it fails, and you'll take you forever to figure out what's going wrong. Bracket, square bracket. So we've got origins, and we've got latitude. There's something, and I'm just going to copy these. Latitude is equal to that. Longitude is equal to that. And then the next part is destinations. And again, we're going to do latitude. We're going to take these coordinates. These will become parameters in a moment, but we're just going to prove that it works. And the final part was travel mode. So we'll just put that in. In my example data set, I don't have the property against the employee, but you can imagine a situation where you did, and it either said the kind of driving, walking, or transit, and we can make that a parameter. I hope I've done that right, because that's the bit that's most likely to fail. It looks like I have on my working one over to the right. So I'm not worried about this failing yet. I'm just interested in whether, when I go to my payload, it's showing me the right thing. So because the headers are there. Now, by default, this function gives you the representation like binary, which isn't helpful to anyone. So you just have to tell it to convert it to text. We're just going to wrap a function around that whole thing. And then look at this again. It's brilliant. So we've got a little bit of JSON here, which has origins is this, latitude, longitude, destinations, latitude, longitude, travel mode. So we're getting close, I think. So now I jump back into the advanced editor. So yeah, we need the relative path, we need the query, but we need the headers as well. So let's give it headers. And we need the content. We need this JSON payload. So content is equal to that. That's not equal to that. It's equal to this. Now the content needs to be in binary form. So like we did here, text from binary, we're going to do kind of the reverse now. Just do it like this. So it converts this string into its binary representation. And if you remembered, we cut and paste this from the other function. So all of this navigation is irrelevant, isn't it? Because this was going to find latitude and longitude. So I'm just going to delete all of that because we're going to have to redo it. So we're just going to look in the document, and yes, it's worked. So now we need to navigate to the right bit of the document. So again, we can go to Postman, and Postman helps us to visualize this a bit better. So we need to go into resource sets, we need to go into resources, and we need to go into results. Nice and easy. Cool. So we're going to resource sets, resources, results. And here's what we're after. So again, we'll convert it to a table. And then because we have this column, we can pivot it by that. Okay. And we can get rid of these bits, we don't need them doing. And we can tell it these are decimals. So for that example request, this is the distance and this is the duration. And we're going to give these better names. Distance and duration. So now the intention is to convert this into a function where we're passing all those different latitude and longitudes. Then it goes off and calculates it for us. Okay, so I could kind of right click and convert it to a function, but I don't have all the parameters set up for the home latitude, home longitude, work latitude. So I'm going to be adventurous and try and convert it manually. So let's see if that works. We're going to do let source is equal to, we need the API key as the text, but then we can do start lat text. And this little symbol tells it it's going to be looking at this. Cool. So there's no red lines here, so I think that's okay. So what we now need to do now is replace these bits here with the parameters that we've passed in. Okay, that we should now have a function. So I'll put it in my functions area. It's not get lat one, it's gets travel details. And it takes the API key and these latitudes, longitudes. So we're in a pretty good state to embed that onto the employees table now. So let's go and do that. So we're going to again invoke a custom function, travel details, and we're going to give it the travel details. Again, I can't figure out why it doesn't let you choose a parameter there, but then we can do column names as home latitudes, home longitude, work latitude, and work longitude. Okay. Now, yeah, this is this error. So because the function has defined all these as text, when I pass the values in, strictly speaking, they're not text, they're kind of this undefined data type. So if I explicitly change those to text and stick that before, now we're getting the kind of the credentials issue because we're not giving it the API key. And then this takes a little moment to go off and think about it. Cool. So now we should have a table at the end. We do. And these are all the different distances and durations. So we can just expand those out into the columns. So now we have how long it takes to travel between work and home and what the distance is in kilometers. And I'm just going to change all those to decimals to tidy it up. And there we go. So that is pretty much the Power Query part of that. I'm just going to jump back into Power BI, kind of finish off the use case. So the company wanted to know the CO2 usage of everyone commuting like that. So we're going to create a few measures. So we do have to wait for the API calls to do it. There we go. So just make it a bit smaller. So we need a new measure and we're going to call it, well, I'm going to use my Cheats thing and look over here. Okay, so we're going to do CO2 tons per day. And that is equal to the sum of the travel distance. Now, the employees travelling to and from work every day, so that's ×2. And then they're travelling to work, well, not 52 weeks a year, but 52 times 5 is 260, but then you've got bank holidays and stuff, so 230 days. And then what did I do? Yes, and then I found a document online which told me it was 122.3 grams per kilometres. That's how much CO2 per kilometre is generated. But that is in grams. So then I can do divided by 1,000 to get kilograms, divided by another 1,000 to get tons. So then I can drag this onto a matrix with the employee ID and matrix, with the employee ID as the column. So then we can see every employee, how many CO2 tons, so it's not per day, it's per year. Now, because I made it per year. So this is how many CO2 tons per year they're doing. And the final measure is kind of the offset. So CO2 tons, and I found something online that said it was 150 pounds. No idea how accurate that is, but there you go. And then I can tell it that's Great British pounds. So then for these 10 employees driving across Lancashire every day, going to and from work, they're generating 27 tonnes of CO2. And the cost to offset that will be a bit more than £4,000. So I imagine there's a few questions about that. So I'm just going to jump back into Power BI, my presentation, because I might be able to kind of head off some of these questions, some issues. So the first issue is, if you're doing that destination matrix, in the code I just did then, it's just one API call per employee, and that you saw it was a bit slow then. The implementation I did for my client was I grouped it by their office, so there was one destination, but in some cases hundreds of employees, but that was only one API call. That worked pretty quick. It was almost as quick as doing just like an API call with one person on there. But then, it got really complicated having to group all the employees down into kind of one, into all those origins or starting points, and to get all the JSON perfectly formatted so it accepted it. And then when you got the response back, you had to ungroup everything, but then it ungroup it in the same order it was grouped in. It was a nightmare. If I was approaching how to do this, I'd recommend you use a logic app and persist the data back into SQL. You can imagine a SQL Server, you can have those columns there, and the logic app comes in, says, give me everything that's blank. Then it goes off and does the request and persists the data back. That'll be my preferred approach. The other problem is this average CO2 usage is kind of okay, but then we've got that magic number at the end that says it's 122 grams. Then we've got another magic number that says it's 150 pounds to offset per tonne. For me, if you're going to be that vague, then why does the start of it have to be mega precise? So my argument was, we know the latitude and longitude of these places. We can do a straight line between them, maybe add 10 or 20% on, because you don't drive in a straight line, and it's probably going to be within a large margin of error, pretty much the same answers. And then you wouldn't have to do all that complicated routing matrix. But the client wanted it like that, so there you go. And the API isn't perfect, and you should remember that for your APIs. There was an instance where one of the London offices was half a mile away from where it should have been. There was an issue with the underlying data, but it was screwing up all the employees' transit trips. They were coming out of different tube stations and it wasn't showing correctly. We had a contact at the Bing Maps API, and they acknowledged it was an issue with the data, but it was never fixed. So super. And then finally, Bing Maps only supports that transit in like UK and America and a couple of other places. So if you're doing like worldwide things, you just need to be kind of aware of that, and you should be aware of the restrictions of your own APIs. So I think, Leon, if you want to jump back in, that's everything from me, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent, fantastic, Lewis. Really good use case there and demonstration on the benefit of using APIs in a real world situation. So thank you very much for that. One of the questions we do have coming in is around handling the API key. So for most web APIs, the keys have a limited shelf life. How do you handle that in terms of making sure that the API stays operational?
Yeah, so yeah, I've worked with APIs where you have to kind of request a key and then you get something back and that's valid for maybe 10 minutes. When I've come across those situations, the type of request I did in the first example, I've done something like that to get the key, but then in the same bit of Power Query, I've reused that key in the second request for the actual data. Now, it does mean every time you hit refresh, you are asking for a new key. And I've spoken to the vendors for the APIs I've used, so that's absolutely fine. Not sure if they're all like that. But yeah, I do acknowledge you are doing two requests every time you hit refresh. The first one's saying, give me the key, and then the second one's using it. Unfortunately, if you don't have access to any of the databases, you can't persist that data anywhere. You can't even share the key across different tables within Power Query, so you are a bit stuck. So yeah, that's the way I've handled it. I've done the first request to get the token, isn't it? And then I've reused that token in the subsequent request, but all in the same piece of Power Query.
Excellent, thank you. And in terms of Power Query from a refresh perspective, is there any performance optimizations we should be aware of when using API calls as part of a dataset refresh?
So if you parameterize the different elements of it, as I did in my example, the Power BI service will refresh it absolutely fine. It won't have a technical issue with doing it. So the speed of it will be down to how many requests you make ultimately and how complicated it is, and how quick the API is to respond. Ultimately, I don't have a better answer than try and reduce the number of requests you're making. If you can do a request that handles multiple things, then you should try and do that rather than doing lots of individual requests.
Excellent, thank you. And have you ever encountered a situation where an API has become unavailable? So, for example, the provider has had some service interruption, which has impacted any data refreshes at all.
Yeah, that's really difficult because it does happen, and there's not a lot really you can do about it, is there? Because Power Query doesn't, the data set in the Power BI service doesn't give you a lot of options if it fails, does it? If it fails, and you just don't get a refresh. You could try separating things out into different data sets. So all the stuff that comes out from an API is in one specific data set, and all your SQL stuff's in another. And then you join those two data sets in a separate data set, or you do something similar in data flows. But yeah, ultimately, it's just try and compartmentalize it into its own area. So if it fails, it impacts as little as possible.
Excellent, thank you, Lewis. And for the perspective of our users who have obviously had their introduction to using APIs today, utilising Postman and how that can help in terms of developing these calls, what would be the next point of call that you would recommend for further learning?
I find a good public API with good documentation. The Big Maps one isn't too bad, and it's fairly interesting as far as the data goes. And I'll start building up some requests against that. You have to make sure the API you're testing against is probably a free one. But yeah, the Big Maps API one's good, and there are equivalent ones in Google and things like that. So yeah, I'll start there.
Excellent. And slightly off topic in terms of a question, but we know that you mentioned that you're working on a contractual basis currently. Myself, having operated in a similar vein, the question that is always posed to me is do you prefer it over permanent work? Would you recommend it? So keen to hear, whilst we have you with us, some of your experiences from a contracting perspective.
Yeah, I certainly prefer it. I prefer kind of the freedom you get. You can pick and choose your own projects. If you're good at what you do, I think you'll find there's always work out there for you, and you'll find work. And you do tend to be a bit more on the cutting edge of things. You're not sat in an office doing SQL Server 2008. You tend to be doing a bit more interesting projects. So for me personally, I would never go back.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lewis. It appears that that's all of the questions that we have coming through so far. So once again, I'd like to thank you for a very highly detailed session, again, delivered in a short space of time, and the knowledge that you've handed over to our user group.
Thank you very much, Leon. I enjoyed myself.
Excellent. And thank you also to everybody that's joined us today from the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. We will be back next week with another session on Thursday at 6 p.m. UK GMT, and it's going to be external tools for Power BI, how to create them, with Microsoft MVP Mark Lilleveld. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Again, stay safe, and I want to say thank you as well to our sponsors, Onyx Data, who have brought this session to us today. And also, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you've been here with us. So thanks again. See you soon. Bye-bye.